afternoon, everybody. I'm not quite sure which one's Yoda and who is Darth Vader, but that was quite the dramatic entrance. I'm not sure I've ever been introduced in that way. And, this panel titled The Energy Awakens, we hope that we're going to keep you awake as well. It looks like a bar in here. Please don't try to hook up with each other in the bar. Wait until later on. We're going to get some drinks delivered to you to make everything easier. My name is Duncan Wood. I'm the president and CEO of the Pacific Council in Los Angeles. I'm delighted to be with four incredible panelists here today. My old friend Jeremy Martin, Vice President for Energy and Sustainability at the Institute of the Americas. Katia Somojano, the CEO of Iberdrola Mexico. Abraham Zamora, Senior Vice President of Corporate and Public Affairs at Sempra Infrastructure. And Jeff Wilson, Vice President, Government, Public Affairs and Sustainability at Devon Energy. Thank you, panelists, for being with us today. To our audience, when we say something that you agree with, disagree with, that you want to challenge, or you just have a question, please use the app, use the Q&A function, and send us questions. We would love to have your thoughts, as crazy as they are, presented to us through the app. This panel is going to focus heavily on the questions of the energy transition, energy cooperation in North America, and the need to build out energy infrastructure in the region. It's one of the most important topics that we're facing today, partly because of the enormous jump in demand that we've seen for energy in North America, partly because of obviously the ongoing challenge of climate change, mitigation, adaptation, and partly because of the different paths that the North American countries seem to be taking on energy policy these days. So we'll be talking about infrastructure, collaboration, and integration throughout this panel. And I'm going to kick things straight off by turning to Jeremy to ask us to give us an overview of where we are in terms of the geopolitics of energy today. Jeremy's going to kind of set the scene for us, and then we're going to delve into the mechanics of the energy transition, infrastructure, collaboration in North America. Jeremy, I wonder if you could set the scene for us.
Well, thank you, Duncan, and thank you to the U.S.-Mexico Foundation, Enrique. Wonderful event, lovely, lovely room. As Duncan said, I felt like this was a living room, but either way, thank you. So I want to step back, and there's 4 quick points. I know we don't have a whole lot of time here. Let me quickly go through 4 big scene-setting points. First of all, a question, is there a new world order? I think this is something to think about. The second is fragmentation and polarization. The third is around industrialization policies. And ultimately, I want to talk a little bit or start to segue our conversation around what Duncan just alluded to in terms of power demand growth. So 2024, and I don't have to tell anyone in this room, but 2024 has been a year of elections, right? Major consequences derived from those elections. On top of that, we continue to have shooting wars in the Middle East, in Europe, in Ukraine with Russia. The shadows of geopolitics not only continue, but get darker and more concerning every day. Accelerated across COVID, accelerated across the post-pandemic recovery. It is a moment of concern when we talk about geopolitics. Only about 30 minutes ago, I got a headline, oil price surges on potential Iran-Israel conflict. So when we looked at the outlook for 2024 at the Institute of the Americas, we all wrote some essays, and I argued that the New World Order is actually disorder, right? And uncertainty. And boy, if there's a dirtier word in the English language or any language for investors and for the energy sector than uncertainty, I don't know it. And so that's part of this sort of, this first point of a disorder, a new world order, but also the issues of polarization and fragmentation, I think, are derivative of where we are in this kind of what I argue is a disorder as the new world order, right? The issues of fragmentation and polarization, again, not unique to Latin America, not unique to this hemisphere, but I will give you 2 or 3 examples that I think emphasize and just underscore where we are in straying away from, unfortunately, collaboration, at least at this point, in a resetting collaboration. The Venezuela electoral crisis has really, really affected major countries in the region, major countries in the hemisphere. And another interesting thing, when you saw the Scheinbaum inauguration this week, there was a photo that went a little bit viral of all the progressive leaders of Latin America, Lula, Boric, Arevalo from Guatemala, and with Ms. Scheinbaum and with the outgoing president. Hey, here's Latin America's progressive leaders. Well, meanwhile, in Buenos Aires, President Milei hosted President Bukele. So I see that sort of as a pictorial emphasis of the fragmentation and polarization. A final point regarding that is North America. There was no North America Leaders Summit this year. And again, electoral cycle, the electoral calendar, absolutely behind that, but also emphasizing this kind of broader trend, constraint or issue of fragmentation and polarization. A lot of this also now has led to interesting policy and interesting legislative developments in many countries around industrialization in terms of bringing back, and what I would argue are resource nationalist policies with regards to the energy sector and with regards to how countries are managing climate action. So this resource nationalist policy or posture has been translated, particularly in the EU, with the Green Deal, and the United States into the Inflation Reduction Act. And we can talk a little bit more later about just exactly what those mean, how they are influencing how countries manage their economic resources, their energy resources, and of course the climate action. You see in the campaign in the US, Vice President Harris bragging and touting just how important IRA has been for the US economy, for industrial policy, for manufacturing, but also for climate action and energy. Which leads me to the final point, and I think it brings all of this together. The uncertainty around how are we going to continue on this path to net zero. And what's grabbing an enormous amount of headlines right now is the spike in demand growth for power, sustainable, clean energy to drive our modern economies. Specifically, the boom in AI and data centers that really has sort of taken many folks by surprise over the last couple of years and revealed such interesting discussions and possible deals like restarting nuclear facilities for contracts with companies like Microsoft. And all of this is despite an enormous amount of progress around renewables. IEA said that 2023 saw the largest amount of deployment of renewable energy ever. Yet we still have a spike in demand. And let me end by saying that spike in demand in this room should also be considered with regards to nearshoring. And I think this is an area where we can force and drive collaboration in Mexico and North America, because the need for sustainable power to really catapult and consolidate that nearshoring boom in Mexico, in North America, is a domestic issue in Mexico. It's a domestic issue in Canada and the US, and requires a North America, or could be helped by a North America solution. So I think all three governments could have a role there. So hopefully I didn't go too long. Those are my four big issues. That's all I got for now. Duncan, back to you.
You did a splendid job in setting the scene. And if I can just recap very briefly, we've got a world of fragmentation. We've got a dramatically increasing energy demand at the time of a worsening climate crisis. We have a need for regional and international collaboration. And if I can just add my own sort of layer on that, which you suggested at, you hinted at, you've got a North American region where you have the United States, which is taking the lead in terms of a massive investment through the Inflation Reduction Act into renewable energy, climate change, adaptation strategies, etc. You've also got Canada, which is following that lead. And then you've got Mexico, which is really moving in a kind of a different direction. I'm not going to say it's the opposite direction, but we see a stark difference there. And although Mexico can benefit from many of the financing mechanisms that are in the Inflation Reduction Act, right now we're seeing a Mexico which is really underperforming in terms of energy generation. And that's why I want to turn to Katia next and to talk about the role of the private sector. Over the past 6 years, we've had a government here in Mexico which has not been successful in increasing energy supply to match demand. It seems to me that Mexico is a country which has enormous potential to boost sustainable sources of energy demand, as well as traditional sources of energy supply. I wonder if you can talk to us, Katia, a little bit about the role that the private sector can play in this, and in particular, the role that Iberdrola can play.
Thank you, Duncan. Great to be here with all friends from a long time and in this gorgeous venue, which remains like we are with friends and having a good time. Yeah, I would say the obvious that our sector, energy sector, is highly regulated one. So we need government to be on board and to help the private sector role to be developed. However, there are certainly some issues where private sectors can start moving and doing its things, which is, of course, fostering the resources needed to develop smart projects. And when I say smart projects, I think that's a new bottleneck. It's a worldwide thing where interconnections are. It's not only Mexico. We see it in UK, in US is the same story. You can't wait like 1 or 2 years for the interconnection to be granted by the authority. And that's why it's so important to pick that strategic project where are developed in the near to the loads, near where the demand is located, and we need to plan that ahead, and we need to have all the intelligence needed to deploy that project where they are really needed. Not only for economic reasons, that can be very attractive, of course, where you can do some kind of arbitrage, but now we are talking about where the load is needed, where the energy is needed. So I think that is one responsible approach that the private sector has to deploy when it comes to developing new projects. Also, we need to work together with the communities to make them part of the project. It is not a matter of being only fulfilling with our social responsibility and requirements or goals or tasks, or from the regulated point of view. It is going beyond that. It is how do you work and create a new ecosystem where communities are on board. And that means creating quality jobs. That means also working with them in what we call in Iberdrola the green employment. That means that they have to understand the role of the projects and all the benefits that brings for the community and their areas of influence. And we need also to work with the local supply chain. I think that's a very important issue that we need also. It's not a matter of having the best of the cheapest resources. We've seen with the pandemic that if you do not have that already near to where it is demanded, you can wait for 1 or 2 years in order to have one transformador. Those strategic equipments that are required need to be developed locally. That means that we need to foster also supply chain that is deployed near where they are. So I think that is another part of the role of the private sector. Of course, also we need also to bring technology to the table. It's amazing how this artificial intelligence and new softwares are developing. Today I was listening to a podcast where, I don't know if you have heard about these digital twins, that are these sort of very complex softwares where they can recreate the way one intermittent system energy, can be either solar or wind, can be producing, and then you can have a hybrid system where you have storage also, and you can predict the way it will be producing. So in this sense, you can meet the demand more appropriately. You can also help the grid not to be so stressed, and of course you can reduce costs for the final off-takers. So I think that is what we've been doing all this year. As you may say, it hasn't been the best years for the private sector in Mexico the last years, to put it in a way. So that doesn't mean that the private sector have to be stopped and waiting for everything to be done and the government to call us and say, now we are ready, you are ready. We have to be ready for when that happens. And I can tell you that we've been working for nearly 3 or 4 years in developing this pipeline of projects, strategic projects, smart projects, where we can be near for where the load are going to be deployed, either existing loads or even those that will be created because of nearshoring or any expansion of the current facilities that the industrials have right now. So I think there's a great amount of work that the private sector can do regardless what the government would do. Because, as I said, of course, we are a highly regulated sector. We need these permits and we need everything to deploy our projects, but we can be ready for when that happens. And I won't talk about infrastructure because I know we'll go there in a minute, but that's another point that is critically for deploying these projects.
Thank you, Katia. And I just want to add I mean, I'm really glad you brought up the point about technology. I spent last week in New York at Climate Week. One of the recurring themes was the importance of innovation, of applying AI, for example, to climate mitigation and adaptation. And I think that AI has an enormous potential for sorting out the problems that we have right now on the grid, and in terms of predicting where demand is going to spike, not just on a yearly basis or a monthly basis, but on an hour-by-hour, minute-by-minute basis, depending on the, how much data we can actually get into the system. So I'm very grateful to you for bringing that up. I want to turn to Abraham. And Abraham, North America as a region is going through this phase of, adapting to the concept of renewable energy, the energy transition. But energy transition and sustainability is only one pillar of the energy trilemma as put forward by the International Energy Agency. And we see the other two pillars are energy equity and energy security. I wonder if you can talk to us a little bit about how here in Mexico in particular, we can see what can be done to satisfy the clean energy goals, energy transition, at the same time as we are guaranteeing security and affordability of energy.
Thank you. Thank you, Duncan. It's a pleasure to share this panel with my colleagues. I think that the most important issue to get cleaner, reliable, and affordable energy in the region is to have energy diversification. What does that mean is we need to use all the different fuels that we have. We need to use the natural gas. We need to use the renewable energy. We need to use storage also in order to have a balanced energy matrix in the region. We need to also have a vision, a regional vision in North America, because we are very fortunate to have in the region natural gas. In the US, we have the cheapest and cleanest gas in the region, but also we have in Mexico a lot of potential in renewables. So we need to have this regional vision and diversify our energy matrix in the region. In the specific case of Mexico, we have great challenges, specifically in the generation side. We need to build in the next 6 years around 37 gigawatts of installed capacity in the power sector. For that, we need more than 40 US billion for that. This effort means more or less in Mexico we did the same size of installed capacity, 37 gigawatts in 15 years. So what we need to do in the next 6 years is more or less what we did between 2008 and 2023. Also, Katia mentioned that, no? Tania is my boss, no?
Also say Claudia.
Claudia, Tania, Carla, no? Katia mentioned that we need also the transmission infrastructure to get with that, not only in Mexico or only in the US. We all say all the time that that without transmission there is no transition. So we need to in Mexico we have more than 10 years that we don't do high investments in the transmission lines. This is more or less 12 US billion that we need to build that transmission lines. And of course, we need to advance more quickly in the incorporation of new technologies for the decarbonization of our economy. That means we need to do regulation and also to have the incentives in Mexico to advance more quickly on that. The US has very good examples of that with the IRA, but we don't have something similar to that. And we need to have those kind of investments and at the same time to have the regulation to advance the decarbonization. I mean, in terms of storage, in terms of hydrogen, in terms of carbon capture, and also the e-fuels. So that's what I see, not only in Mexico, but in the region, because we have in Sempra infrastructure this vision of that we need to see the energy policy as a regional policy, because we have a lot of potential if we do that as a region.
Thank you, Abraham. I'd like to push you just a little bit on the point about energy affordability or energy equity. How do we make sure that energy gets to the people who need it at a price at which they can afford it?
Yeah, well, we need first to have the infrastructure to do that, because we can spend a lot of public resources to do that. But the best way to do that is to have the transmission lines, for example, in order that all the generation that we are doing in one place, we can move it to the place where it is demanded. So we need to have first the infrastructure, and then of course, a policy devoted to do that in those regions that we don't have enough capacity and enough infrastructure to get better prices, not only the energy, but also the best prices for that.
Thank you, Abraham. I'm going to turn to Jeff now, who I think probably has, in part, an answer to that previous question. I saw you nodding and smiling. Jeff, over the past decade, we've seen an extraordinary revolution that's taken place here in North America. The United States has become not only the world's largest oil producer, the world's largest natural gas producer, the world's largest now, I think it's on the verge of becoming, if it hasn't already, the world's largest natural gas exporter. It's an extraordinary transformation from the situation back in the mid-2000s when the United States was still worried about energy security and being vulnerable. Scarcity, exactly. And we all remember those crazy conversations about peak oil. We have now gone through a full sort of 360 on this, or maybe a 180. The United States is now, to adopt a Trumpian term, is energy dominant, but it's certainly energy secure. We have that enormous source of energy there in the United States, also being produced in Canada. Can you talk to us a little bit about the potential of natural gas to satisfy a lot of the demand for energy, for electricity generation, for example, but also that question of energy equity and affordability?
Yeah, these are great questions. And Jeremy talked about disruption. And, I'd like to just cast you back to think about this for a minute. Could you imagine a time geopolitically when we had this much disruption, this many hot wars going on, and thinking about the idea that oil only rose a few pennies, a couple of cents here and there, maybe $1, and natural gas stayed flat or even went down? We are tremendously blessed in North America with resources. The discussion at dinner last night, we talked about, North America as this island of resource wealth, and that is absolutely the case. And it's not just fossil wealth; it is renewable wealth as well. And so we know that we are in this tremendously blessed place, given everything that's going on. The real question then becomes, what do we do? And we know that we are thirsty for energy, for all forms of energy. We talked a little bit about AI, and we talked a little bit about nearshoring. Both of those things do not happen without dramatically increasing demands for energy. And so how do we supply that? And I think the answer to that will be, we need everything in our toolbox to accomplish that. We're going to need every form of renewable resource we can get, but we're also going to have reliability, and we're going to have the ability to stem intermittency. And so natural gas is going to play an important part of that in solving the problems that happen when we know that we can't get renewable resource to a data center, when we can't get a renewable resource to homes in areas where the sun doesn't shine all the time and the wind doesn't blow as much. And we'll go here in a minute to the question around how do you do that? And I think infrastructure is a big portion of this, but I'll just point out a few facts. Duncan, you mentioned the real transition and revolution around energy production in the U.S. and in North America. I would say not just in the U.S., but in North America. And, what that has meant. What it means for Mexico in particular has meant that we have record levels of natural gas imports into Mexico from the U.S. We're about to cross the 6.5 BCF threshold a day in 2024. So think about this in terms of what does that mean for the U.S. The U.S. produces about 20 BCF for export a day. So you're thinking about roughly 30% of the U.S.'s natural gas coming to its partner, coming to its neighbor here in Mexico. And if you take what Avram said around what we know has to happen to provide equity, to get those electrons to people in all parts of the continent, what we know is that that's going to require about a doubling of what the U.S. currently sends into Mexico now from a natural gas perspective, if you think about roughly 40 gigawatts of electricity. And so we know that we have a tremendous amount of resource, but I do want to kind of answer the question that you put there at the end to Avram, which is, what does it require? Some of this has happened just via brute force, frankly. It's just willpower that has gotten us to this place, putting good minds into places where we have resource. And what it's going to take to go forward and to really expand the energy transition and the energy addition, really, because we're talking about adding all forms of electricity and all forms of energy here, it's going to take sound public policy, and it's going to take regional integration, and it's going to take diplomacy to do that. Thinking about in the U.S., the U.S. had a historic passage of the Inflation Reduction Act. Lots of money, but money at the end of the day cannot get it done if, as Avram said, you don't have the wires. And that requires permitting reform in the U.S. It requires diplomats and energy policy people in the U.S. and in Mexico and in Canada coming together to talk about how we create a stable energy economy in North America and how we do that together. Because to fracture, to Jeremy's earlier point, to think about resource nationalism, that's not how North America succeeds. That's not what we have at the heart of these discussions here at the North Capitol Forum today. We're going to need policy to push us forward, and that requires some fortitude, frankly, some real political fortitude in what will be new administrations in the U.S. and in Mexico and in Canada in the future. And so I look forward to that because I think we can. I'm positive about our ability to do that, but it's going to take us all pulling together and holding those folks to account and saying this is what we need for energy equity, to your point earlier, Duncan.
Thank you, Jeff. I think that in that first round of questions, we've heard a compelling case for deeper integration, for building out a cross-border infrastructure, for connection between private sectors, but also between governments. And yet, as we heard earlier on, we haven't had a North American Leaders Summit this year. We desperately need to see a conversation between the three governments on energy integration. We haven't had that for a long time. We have here in Mexico a conversation which has been dominated by a catchphrase of energy sovereignty rather than energy security or the energy trilemma. And I think that that's something which we need to address. How do we overcome that kind of resource nationalism, energy nationalism, which is not just here in Mexico, as Jeremy suggested? How do we move the agenda forward? What are the steps that we can take from either the private sector side or from governments or from civil society to move the conversation forward? I want to think about things like how do we move the energy trade forward? Talking about the growing demand for natural gas and thinking about the potential for us to boost exports of energy from North America in general to the rest of the world. Think about what we've been through over the past couple of years in terms of the demand, the growing demand, rapidly growing demand for LNG in Europe because of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. how do we think about how the United States, Mexico, and Canada not only satisfy their own needs, but begin to actually provide or to play that role of providing energy to the rest of the world? I encourage all of you to send questions. I've got a couple of come in, which I'll go to next. But Jeremy, first of all, your answer to that.
Just really quickly, so, I think there were some encouraging signs from the speech by Dr. Scheinbaum earlier this week, but it's not either or. How do we do a PR campaign, and how do we make everyone understand in government and across our North American stakeholders that it's not either or? What I mean, it's not either or. It's not the government with the solutions only, or it's not the private sector with the solutions only. You have IRA, you have government playing a role of de-risking, right? There are technologies, low carbon solutions that at this point require some government support to move those to a scalable solution, to move those to where they've been de-risked so private sector can deploy them at a level that's affordable and scalable, right? So that's one side of it. And then the government, as we've all alluded to here, should set the clear and consistent rules of the game. I said there's no dirtier word than uncertainty for investors, particularly in the energy sector. And so if there are clear policies and clear regulatory frameworks, Katya talked extensively about how dependent they are on regulatory approvals, permitting, and decisions. So we need government, as some folks say, to get out of the way, but it's not getting out of the way in either or, right? You can be statist and you can be, liberal, market-minded, and have all of that working together, right? There is a lot of things the government should do, allocating the de-risking money that's IRA, but it doesn't just have to be IRA. Why can't Pemex? Petrobras is allocating hundreds and hundreds of billions of dollars to low carbon solutions, to offshore wind, to CCUS, to innovating in those spaces, right? Okay, I shouldn't have brought up Pemex in that regard, but the final point is, let's bring back the North American Energy Working Group. This was something across government that sometimes involved stakeholders in academia, think tanks, and the private sector. It sort of lost steam somewhere along the way. I don't even remember where, but the North American Energy Working Group, I would suggest, is a wonderful platform to try and overcome all of the negative things I've said.
Thank you. I mean, this is a great think tanker response, I think, Jeremy. Let's get the brains into the room and let's put some statistics on the table. But just to back up what Jeremy said, I mean, the North American Energy Working Group was a spin-off of the Security and Prosperity Partnership in the early 2000s. It kind of died a death at the end of that decade, partly because, it just lost energy and people weren't really investing in it. But then, in the sort of around 2014, we saw a new round of enthusiasm where the energy ministers were getting together on a regular basis, and they were talking about building up the statistical basis for energy in North America. They mapped out energy infrastructure in North America. Those maps are still there on government websites, and you can look at them, but they haven't been updated. Unfortunately, in 2016 or 2017, when President Trump came into power, that effort died. In 2018, it received another death blow once Andrés Manuel López Obrador became president of Mexico. There wasn't the enthusiasm for energy integration so much. But I think it is a very valid idea. Katya, what would you say would be sort of one or two things that we could do to move the conversation forward on energy integration?
Well, energy is a very complex matter. So I think we have to go to the very beginning of the needs of this complementary vision to understand that there's no way to do it, in a different direction. So for me, I would say that the first thing that we have to do is to look at the success of the projects, the cross-border projects that are already developed, like all this impressive network of 7,000 kilometers that were built in recent years in Mexico, that were the infrastructure needed to bring all the natural gas that Mexico needed, because Mexico was not producing natural gas. So just if you think about this was made just in time to meet the demand that Mexico was needed for the industrial reasons, let alone electricity. So one of the things is to look up the success of that infrastructure that is already there. The same happens with the international ties. In Texas, we have international ties. We have international ties, of course, in California, and we have few. And there has been a matter of complementarity with the U.S. had different climate situations that, U.S. Geographic, power geographic is different than the one that we had in Mexico. They have different markets. They work in different ways, they have different rules, and they are not interconnected. So when Texas had some problems facing the demand because of climate or other reasons, they can benefit from the international ties that have with Mexico. So that's a happy story to be told and to have in mind. And then, following this argument, I would go for specific projects. We need to start moving the conversation toward, stories that can have happy endings again. If we wait for the big policies and the big diplomatic efforts to move and to understand and to meet the timing and everything, we may need to wait probably a decade or so. So both pillars are complementary. We need international diplomatic efforts to understand and political will, of course, but we also need smart projects to be there and to have the resources in terms of economic resources, in terms of innovation again, in terms of the players that are needed to be there, and communities and local governments in the case of both countries, Mexico and US. So once you have that ecosystem, then you can go again with the governments and say, I need this. And if this is a good thing that happen, that work for everybody, we can wait, we can assume and we can expect that model can be replicated. So that's what I think we should, and of course, start working with this transborder vision. We know, for example, I know Jeremy knows that I go often to San Diego because of family reasons. So when I see this cross-border airport that we have there, I think about everything that can be deployed between the two countries. So of course, we need these cross-border working groups of task forces that can understand and identify these priority projects to be developed.
Wonderful. I'm going to turn to you next, Jeff, if I may. And just to talk about, we've been talking a little bit about, a lot of us here on this panel have been around long enough that we've seen this story sometimes before, right? Back in 2011, 2012, before those pipelines were built across the border, Mexico was facing a real challenge to its competitiveness because the cost of energy was so high that even with the lower cost of labor and the other competitive elements of the Mexican economy, investors were choosing the southern United States, where they not only had cheap energy, but they had reliable energy. I'm worried that we're getting to a situation again here in Mexico where, the cost of energy is going to go up, and certainly we do not have security of supply and reliability of supply. That is a competitiveness issue, not just for Mexico, but for North America as a region, given our integrated manufacturing platform. So Jeff, talking about cross-border energy, how can we ensure that we get enough energy across the border into Mexico? You've talked about building out pipelines. What are the other things that need to happen?
Well, I think one of the first things, and this answers maybe the question to a certain extent that you put to Katya too, is we have to stop thinking about North American energy as a parochial issue. It is not a zero-sum game. North American competitiveness is going to increase when we think about each other as partners and teammates rather than competitors. And that only happens when you start to think about how you build out things together. And you can't let that moment become a crisis before you take action. It takes planning and it takes thought. And so it's not just natural gas pipelines that need to be built from the US to Mexico. It's wires that need to be built from Mexico to Southern California, which Avram can talk about, right? Like there are resources that have to be shared between all three countries. And we've seen far too many times where we've let, nearsighted or parochial interests stop us from building out international infrastructure. You can think about it between the US and Canada. You can think about it between Mexico and the US. We can all point to examples where we've let the political lack of a will to put infrastructure in place cause us to miss the opportunity to further integrate. And we have to break down that mentality in our policymakers. And I think it takes a dialogue between private sector and policymakers to do this. But we have to break down that mentality that, I have to get something from my partners in order to win. And so we have something coming up with the renegotiation or revisiting of USMCA. There's an energy chapter, an important energy chapter in USMCA. I think it probably wasn't the thing that caught all the headlines the last time around, but it has the potential to catch a lot of headlines this time around. And what we really need to focus on is taking something like the energy chapter and making it an example, a shining example of how this trilateral relationship can work and can make North America more competitive, because we know that energy demand around the world is going to go up, especially in the global south. It's just a question of where that energy comes from. And quite frankly, if we don't get this right, it's going to come from places that are going to further destabilize the world, not make the world a better place, which is what we want to do. It's what all three of our countries want to do. It's very clearly our aim. And so I think we need to really put that at the front of the discussion when we start to think about how do we change the dynamic between our three countries when it comes to energy policy.
Thank you, Jeff. And you've set Abraham up perfectly there. So I'll just give you a very brief lead in here, which is that thinking about that North American energy integration, and in particular how it pertains to exporting energy from the region, Abraham. I wonder if you could talk to us a little bit about that, maybe LNG exports from the West Coast.
Yes, Duncan. Just let me do a reflection also about this issue of sovereignty, more related to the case of Mexico, because we have a very good example of what we can go to that point, because we have NAFTA. We have the USMCA as a very good example of something that has benefit the three countries, and that we have 30 years ago in Mexico this issue about also if we lose some kind of sovereignty with that agreement or not. So 30 years later, we are very conscious that the NAFTA and the USMCA has benefited Mexico a lot, and we need to move also in the energy issues in that regard. We need to think that the energy integration will be very good. It's good today, but will be very good for the competitiveness, not only of North America, but also specifically for Mexico. The new government needs to be aware that it can benefit their priorities and also their specific projects that they want to do in the regions. No, if they have with energy integration, cheaper energy, affordable energy, and also a more reliable system. No, so that's and let me go to the other issue about the LNG. As the geopolitical issues change, and we don't see this association between the U.S. and Mexico in the specific case of the LNG maybe 10 years ago, because that issue was not on the table. However, today Mexico is a very good platform to be a partner of the U.S. on that, not only of a U.S.-Mexico vision, but also with the vision of helping other partners, of other U.S. partners in the world, specifically in Europe, and Mexico is a good partner to do that. So that's a very good example of what can we do if we advance more quickly in the energy integration. And as I mentioned, I think the USMCA is a very good example of what we have been doing together, and the way in which we can work to benefit the three parties, and also and for the new government which has this nationalistic view, we can they can be convinced that that energy integration is good for their purposes and objectives.
Thank you, Abraham. One little anecdote I'd like to add is that I spent a lot of time in South Texas talking to folks down there about Mexico, and I've been speaking a lot recently over the last 18 months or so about the interoceanic corridor. And folks in the port of Brownsville, for example, have become very, very interested in that in terms of a long-term perspective where perhaps we could see LNG exports via LNG tankers coming out of Brownsville, coming down to the interoceanic corridor, maybe on trains or maybe on a pipeline that's built across there and off to the Pacific. All of a sudden, you get sort of South Texas gas that's going to Asian markets in a much more direct way. And thinking of outside of the box about our energy solutions, I think is the only way for us to go. I've got 3 questions from the audience, and I'm going to name the people who were kind enough to put forward these questions. I'm going to put all 3 questions to all of the panelists so you can choose, because there's a question here about the government that some of our private sector folks may not want to answer, okay? So the first question that I've got here is from Marilu Cisneros. How is it possible to transform the energy landscape of North America when Mexico plans to reform the energy sector towards a less business-friendly environment? That's number 1. Second question. This is from Ana Cristina Gadala Maria. What's your perspective on solar energy and particularly distributed generation? Do you think this is an important source of energy moving forward? And I just would emphasize the distributed generation aspect of that because that's come up a number of times in our conversation. And lastly, from Stony Brook, the IRA serves as a policy that can positively drive regional energy development. However, the LNG pause announced by the White House is creating a chilling effect for regional partnerships that would take US gas and exports through large LNG infrastructure investments in Mexico. How should policymakers work to ensure better policy alignment that drives regional energy integration? Let's go in reverse. Abraham, which of those questions would you like to address?
Well, I think that distributed generation will be very useful to cover some specific and local needs that have, for example, industrial parks. However, this is not a systemic solution. Given the needs that we have as a system, no, we can use the distributed generation and like a very local. It's not the cheapest solution for the problem. It is a solution, but it is very concentrated in size and also in location. But we need a broader solution for the system, and also because the distributed generation needs distribution lines that we don't have enough distribution lines in all the country to cover that. So it is a solution, yes, but it is a very local, not the cheapest one, and we need a broader and a general systemic solution to the power situation.
I mean, just one thing about solar that I will say, we've talked about the disruption of energy markets over the last decade or so. What's happened to the price of solar is nothing short of miraculous. And what's driven that, of course, is manufacturing in China. And so as we're thinking about energy solutions within North America, we can't forget about what's happening in the rest of the world. Supply chains have already been mentioned. And it's the question is, if we want to really square the circle of the energy trilemma, there are many cases where we're actually not going to be able to do it without trading with China. And that may seem like anathema sometimes when you're up on Capitol Hill in Washington, but it is actually the truth in my opinion. Jeff, over to you.
I'd love to take the LNG question.
Pick your poison. There we go.
And I thank my old friend Stoney for the question. I will tell you, it's really important, and it doesn't matter if you're in Mexico or in Canada or in the US, when companies are contemplating investing billions of dollars in long-term infrastructure projects like LNG export facilities, that you have sound public policy that, as Jeremy said earlier, one way or the other, we just need to know what the playing field is. And to change midstream, you can't count on investment over the long term when you do that. There's a geopolitical point to this, though. The U.S. administration has made significant investments in renewable energy, and kudos to them for doing that, because it's changing the supply chain perspective for how we think about clean energy regionally, specifically in the U.S. But you can't do that and then fail to realize the importance of LNG to our allies abroad. And you mentioned exports off the west coast of Mexico. That is a prime example. There are economies in the Asia Pacific region that are our strong allies, like Japan, like Taiwan, like Korea, that need domestic US LNG to come to their ports. And the way that we do that is to build out additional infrastructure, not just in the Gulf Coast of the US, but off the west coast of Mexico and off the west coast of Canada. Because that means that generally means about a 10-day quicker trip for an LNG tanker to Asian markets when you take it off the coast of Baja and take it to, say, Taiwan. The administration needs to realize that pulling the rug out from under U.S. and Mexican producers, when we do that, we don't do that in a vacuum. We saw immediately that the Qataris, when that happened, filled the gap with cargoes into Europe. And Europe would not have survived the last winter without domestic LNG landing in ports like Rotterdam, landing in ports in Spain, and we would have seen devastating consequences across the European landscape had we not been able to scale up LNG. And so we know that we're an important part of that mix, and we know that we need to continue to be an important part of that mix. And the wrong way to approach that is to say, now we're just going to stop. And we're going to have an indeterminate pause with no real rationale behind why we're doing it, and no real decision-making framework for how we get to what's next. And so I would encourage, policymakers, both in the US and in Mexico and in Canada, to think about the importance of, as we've said earlier, what it means for North America to be the supplier of choice for markets around the world.
We've had another question come in, the joys of a live panel here. Would Mexico reject, or maybe it should be, should Mexico reject clean energy investment from China, a country that has mastered the mass production, especially in the battery industry? An interesting question. I suspect that Jeremy's going to end up getting a lot of these questions at the end himself, because Katya's going to avoid those maybe.
I will leave that question for Jeremy.
There we
Thank
go.
you.
Please, Katya.
No, but I agree. I mean, just going partially to that point, I think I agree that we need a resilient supply chain. And it can't be denied that China's goods in the industry had an enormous role and have helped a lot decreasing the prices of and making it affordable for everybody. So I think that's something that the politicians have to consider, not me and not today here. But going back to the point, I would just like to pick first question and to mention something that give us a little comfort in terms of the target that the President Sheinbaum just mentioned 2 days ago. Reaching this 45% of renewable energy for 2030 means that a lot of investment will be needed. And we need to wait, of course, to see the house and all the instruments that the government decide to put there, and to have all the private sector will how the way that we will be participant of all this new green revolution that is supposed to be the objective in this new government. The other thing that, of course, is needed, and apparently it will be there, is a transparent legal framework that even if we have it there, it hasn't been applied in these years. So I think the connection between having a strong, transparent, and coherent legal framework that can be applied, efficiently applied, it's enough. It's good enough. We will forget about subsidies, forget about other kind of incentives. This is what the private sector, at least a company like mine, will need. So, and then projects like solar, of course, Mexico. I don't have to go and mention the incredible potential of our country in terms of solar projects, because that is there. And when you think about distributed generation, it's the other side of the coin. It's there, and it's the way to make it affordable to everybody again. But I think we have to think it in a wider way. We have to think about smart grids. We have to think about the storage also. We have to think about, again, creating an ecosystem to really take advantage of that treasure that we have as a country, that is the enormous potential of solar. So distributed energy is there, it's good, it's a very a good solution for some industries some companies that provide. You don't have to go to all the very complex and tortuous, I would say, legal route, but it's there and it's okay. But you cannot think about finding a real solution for the country, especially with the demand, 4% of demand every year, increasing demand that we have. It's not the final solution. It helps a lot, and we need to foster it. Of course, it's very important, but I wouldn't like to see distributed demand is already there and forget about the rest. We need to have all the part of the system in its right place.
Thank you, Katia. Jeremy.
Where do I start?
All of the above.
China. No, let's end with China. But just quickly on DG, I think everyone has talked about that. One final point, because we did talk about energy equity, and the numbers are not necessarily always terribly accurate, but there's anywhere from 15 to 20 million people in this hemisphere in Latin America without access to modern energy. A lot of that is rural, a lot of that is poverty, energy poverty. But I think DG can play a role, distributed generation can play a role, particularly in areas where you're not going to be able to build infrastructure to deliver those energy services, those energy requirements. It can displace a lot of the biomass usage in some of those communities. It can be an excellent source of off-grid targeted solutions, particularly solving some of the energy poverty, energy access. So I agree with everything that was said. It's not the systemic solution. It's not going to mean that Mexico will be able to sustain and catapult its nearshoring boom on the back of DG, but I think it has a utility that we should not discard outright. Do we want to go to China now? There were some other questions. Let me
say
throw
what you want about China.
Let me throw one thing about the wires, and I think this point, lots of discussion around integration, interconnection. There's an enormous amount of resource potential for renewable development in Baja California. There's a small tie with California. It's very complex. There's a lot of technical elements that need to be developed between the two states, between the two markets, but there's no connection to the national grid. I moved to California, I moved to San Diego almost 23 years ago. And I heard, probably in the North American Energy Working Group, a presentation from CFE with the timeline and the plans to interconnect the Baja system with the national grid. Here we are almost 23 years later. So my point there is, let's also think about some low-hanging fruit in terms of how we can facilitate more domestic availability of supply, because of what's hindering some of that development in Baja of the wind and solar is the fact that if you're not able to move it to the California market, you can't move it to the Mexican national grid. And so you have scarcity, you have brownouts, you have issues in the national grid. I'm not saying they would be immediately solved, but perhaps in a medium term, alleviated by greater infrastructure that would connect the national grid with Baja. And I want to end with this point. There was a project, there was a public-private project that was tendered, that was going to be developed in contract by a private entity on behalf of the government. And those are the kinds of things I think where I talked about shouldn't do either or, right? There's absolutely a role for government and there's absolutely a role for private sector. And let's figure out where the two meet. China. Foreign entities of concern is a weird term, but that's what we're talking about. And that's what, if you dig deep into the Congressional Research Service and you look at the Inflation Reduction Act, there's something called foreign entities of concern. Okay, it's a synonym for China. And it's particularly regarding electric vehicle batteries and the supply chain around electric vehicle development and battery supply chains. And what it's trying to do is limit, if not wholly stop, the role of China or the ability of China to continue to grow its dominant position by way of moving into North America, by way of moving into Mexico, and taking advantage of some of the North American treaty obligations and opportunities, and of course IRA provisions. So a lot of that has to be sorted out. There's some sliding timelines, as I understand some of that, but it's not that it hasn't been looked at. And there are issues being developed to address this. But at the end of the day, look, we've seen Chinese acquisitions of assets in the renewable space in Mexico, as elsewhere in the world. I don't see how you stop that. a sovereign nation, a company selling its assets in the global marketplace, will sell them to the largest bidder, to the best market participant.
We're almost at time, but Jeremy always likes to end his panels when he's a moderator with a yes/no question. So I'm going to do that as well. And Katia has already mentioned the question I want to ask, which is that in her 100 points the other day, President Sheinbaum said that she would reach 45% of electricity generation from renewable sources by 2030. Will she do it, yes or no, Jeremy?
Oh, I thought it was reverse order.
Jeremy?
Yes.
Katia?
Yes.
Jeff?
No.
Aram?
Pass. Abraham turns the mic away.
Is your microphone not working anymore?
What? Check.
Yes.
Did we have 2 yeses and 2 nos, or did we have 3 yeses and 1 no?
3 yeses.
Wait,
3 yeses. It's a no for me. There's no way it's going to happen, in my opinion. But I mean, what do I know? Ladies and gentlemen, please thank our panelists. Excellent discussion.